They laughed when the auctioneer called him broken, a German shepherd no one wanted, until Ethan Cole stepped forward and paid $20 without blinking. But that night the dog didn't sleep. He stared at the wall, counting something. Every 27 seconds his ears snapped up, his body tense, like he was hearing a heartbeat beneath the ground. Ethan felt it too, a rhythm he remembered from war, buried signals, hidden lives. The dog suddenly bolted into the woods, dragging him through the dark to an abandoned bunker sealed for decades. And when Ethan touched the rusted door, the ground pulsed again, exactly 27 seconds apart, like something, or someone, was still waiting below. Some things aren't abandoned, they're just waiting for the right person to listen. The auction yard smelled of dust and old wood, a dry wind slipping between rusted fences as a line of unwanted animals stood beneath a pale afternoon sky, their tags fluttering like forgotten names. And at the far end, barely noticed, was the German shepherd they called broken, his coat dull beneath the sun, one ear slightly bent, his body still but not weak, just quiet in a way that made people uncomfortable. The auctioneer barely glanced at him when he muttered, "This one's no good, doesn't respond, doesn't follow commands." And a few people chuckled, turning away as if the dog had already disappeared. But Ethan Cole didn't move. He stood there in his worn denim jacket, hands tucked into his pockets, eyes steady, the kind of stillness that comes from years of carrying things no one else can see. He had come for nothing in particular, just passing through another town that wouldn't remember his name. But something about the dog held him there. Not pity, not curiosity, something quieter, like recognition. The dog lifted his head slowly, amber eyes meeting Ethan's, and for a moment the noise of the yard seemed to fall away. No barking, no voices, just that gaze, steady, aware, almost knowing, as if the dog had been waiting, not for a buyer, but for him. The auctioneer sighed, tapping the clipboard. $20 if anyone wants him. And silence followed, thick and dismissive, until Ethan stepped forward without a word, pulling a folded bill from his pocket, placing it in the man's hand like it was already decided long before he arrived. A few heads turned. Someone laughed softly. Guy just paid for a useless dog. But Ethan didn't answer. He simply took the worn leash, his fingers brushing the dog's neck for the first time, feeling the warmth beneath the rough fur, steady, alive, the kind of presence that didn't need to prove itself. And as they walked away, the dog didn't pull or hesitate. He moved beside Ethan with a quiet precision, each step measured, as if he already understood the path ahead. The sun dipped lower, stretching long shadows across the gravel road as they reached the edge of town, the wind carrying a faint metallic scent from somewhere unseen. Ethan glanced down once. The dog's ears flicked slightly, not at a sound, but at something deeper, something Ethan couldn't yet hear. And that was when he realized this wasn't just a rescue. It was the beginning of something he hadn't been looking for, something that had already begun long before he arrived. Because some things don't make noise when they call for you. They wait, patiently, until you're quiet enough to notice. The road out of town stretched long and quiet beneath a fading sky, the kind of road that seemed to forget where it began. And Ethan Cole drove slowly, one hand resting on the wheel, the other draped loosely near the worn gear shift, while beside him the German shepherd sat upright, still as a statue, his gaze fixed not on the passing trees or the dimming horizon, but somewhere deeper, somewhere unseen. As if the world carried another layer only he could hear, the truck's engine hummed low and steady, a familiar rhythm. But underneath it, something else lingered, something faint and almost impossible to notice unless you had spent years listening for things that did not want to be found. Ethan glanced at the dog, studying the subtle tension in his posture, the slight tilt of his head, the way his ears shifted not randomly but with intention, tracking something that had not yet reached human senses. And for a moment Ethan felt that old instinct stir again, the one he had tried to bury. After leaving the service, the one that told him silence was never truly empty. They drove for another mile before the dog shifted suddenly, not in panic, not in fear, but with a quiet alertness, his body leaning forward just slightly, his nose lifting as if catching a signal carried on the wind. Ethan slowed the truck without thinking, gravel crunching softly beneath the tires as the trees thickened on either side of the narrow road. The sun now dipping behind the ridge, casting long shadows that stretched like fingers across the earth. The air carried a faint metallic scent, subtle but distinct, the kind of smell that did not belong to nature alone, and the dog's ears snapped forward, holding still in a way that made Ethan's chest tighten with recognition. "You hear something, boy," he murmured, though he already knew the answer. The dog did not respond with movement. He did not bark. He simply waited, listening, as if counting. Ethan pulled the truck to a stop near a break in the tree line, the engine ticking as it cooled, and for a moment everything was still, no wind, no distant traffic, just the quiet settling of the evening. And then Ethan felt it. Not a sound exactly, not something his ears caught, but something beneath that, a subtle shift, like a vibration carried through the ground itself, faint but steady. He stepped out of the truck, boots pressing into the dirt, the cool air brushing against his face, and the dog followed immediately, moving ahead a few steps before stopping, turning back just enough to make sure Ethan was there, not leading blindly, but guiding with purpose. Ethan walked toward him, each step measured, the ground uneven beneath his feet, scattered with fallen leaves and small stones, and then it came again, a pulse, soft, rhythmic, almost like a heartbeat buried beneath layers of soil. Ethan froze, counting without meaning to 1, 2, 3, all the way to 27, and then it came again, the same faint tremor, exactly the same. His breath slowed, his mind pulling from memories he had tried to leave behind, nights spent listening through rubble, waiting for signs of life where none should have been, signals that came in patterns, not random, never random. He looked at the dog, who stood perfectly still, eyes focused on a spot deeper in the woods, and Ethan understood then that this was no coincidence. The dog was not reacting. He was recognizing, the kind of recognition that came from training, from experience, from something learned long before this day. "All right," Ethan said quietly, his voice steady despite the tension building beneath it. "Show me." And the dog turned without hesitation, moving into the trees, his steps deliberate, not rushing, not hesitating, weaving between trunks as if he had walked this path before. Ethan followed, branches brushing against his jacket, the forest growing denser with each step, the light fading into a soft gray that blurred the edges of everything. The ground sloped gently downward, the air growing cooler, heavier, and the scent of metal became stronger, sharper, until it was impossible to ignore. After several minutes the dog stopped at the edge of a small clearing, overgrown and nearly swallowed by time. And there, half hidden beneath layers of dirt and moss, was something that did not belong, a structure, low and solid, its surface worn but unmistakably man-made, a rusted steel door set into the earth, its edges sealed by years of neglect. Ethan stepped closer, his heart steady but his mind racing. The dog moved to the door, placing one paw gently against the metal, his ears lifting again, and then Ethan felt it once more, the pulse, stronger now, clearer, rising up through the ground and into the soles of his boots. He closed his eyes for a brief second, counting again, 27, and when he opened them, the world felt different, as if something beneath them had been waiting not just to be found, but to be answered. The dog looked back at him, not with urgency, not with fear, but with certainty, and in that moment Ethan realized that whatever lay beyond that door was not random. It was not forgotten. It had been calling, patiently, steadily, waiting for someone who would finally listen. The metal of the door was colder than it should have been, as if it had been holding on to the absence of sunlight for far too long, and Ethan kept his hand pressed against it, feeling not just the rough texture beneath his palm, but the faint, steady tremor that rose through it like a distant echo. 27 seconds, he counted again without thinking, the rhythm exact, unchanging, almost deliberate, and beside him the dog remained still, his posture alert but calm, his amber eyes fixed on the seam where the door met the earth, as though he understood that whatever lay beneath was not meant to be rushed. Ethan stepped back slowly, his breath visible in the cooling air, and for a moment he simply listened, not with his ears alone, but with that deeper awareness that had once kept him alive in places where silence carried meaning. The forest around them seemed to lean inward, the wind softening, the distant rustle of leaves fading until the only thing that mattered was the quiet pulse beneath their feet. "You have been here before, haven't you?" Ethan murmured, not expecting an answer. Yet the dog's ears flicked at the sound of his voice, not in confusion but in recognition. As if the question itself had weight, Ethan crouched down, brushing away a thin layer of dirt from the lower edge of the door, his fingers tracing along the rusted hinges, the bolts worn but still intact. And then he saw it, faint but unmistakable, a marking etched into the metal, partially hidden by time, a number, followed by letters, not random, not decorative, but official, the kind of identification used in places that were never meant to be seen by the public. His chest tightened slightly as memory surfaced: storage units, underground shelters, temporary sites that became permanent secrets, places where things were left behind because they could not be taken with them. Ethan stood again, his mind moving through possibilities, each one heavier than the last. The dog shifted closer to the door, placing his paw against it once more, not scratching, not forcing, just resting there, as if confirming its presence. And then he let out a low, soft sound, not quite a growl, not fear, but something older, something instinctive. Ethan felt it too, that subtle pull, the sense that this moment was not sluchiner, not an accident of timing, but part of something that had been waiting to complete itself. He glanced around the clearing, noting the unnatural stillness, the way the ground dipped slightly toward the structure, as though the earth itself had settled around it over time. And he realized that this place had been deliberately hidden, not just abandoned, but concealed, the kind of concealment that required intention, that required someone to walk away knowing it might never be found again. Unless something led the way back, his gaze returned to the dog, who now looked up at him, his expression steady, patient, and for the first time since they had met, Ethan felt a shift in their connection. Something deeper than coincidence, something closer to purpose. "All right," Ethan said quietly, his voice carrying a resolve that had not been there before. "If something is down there, we do this carefully." He moved toward the truck, retrieving a small toolkit from behind the seat, the metal clinking softly as he set it down near the door, the familiar weight of the tools grounding him. Giving shape to the uncertainty, he worked slowly, testing the bolts, applying steady pressure rather than force, each movement measured, deliberate, the way he had learned to handle things that could not be undone once opened. The dog remained close, watching, listening, and as Ethan loosened the first bolt, the vibration beneath them seemed to deepen, not stronger, but clearer, as if whatever lay below was aware of the change above. He paused, his hand hovering over the next bolt, counting again, 27. The pulse came right on time, unchanged, unwavering, and that was what unsettled him the most. Not the presence of the rhythm, but its precision, because nature did not keep time like this, not perfectly, not endlessly. This was something else, something that had been set in motion and had never stopped. He exhaled slowly, steadying himself, then continued, the second bolt loosening with a low creak, the sound echoing faintly in the quiet clearing, and for a brief moment, the dog's ears snapped upward, his body stiffening just slightly, not in alarm, but an acknowledgement, as if a boundary had just been crossed. Ethan finished the last bolt and stepped back, the door now held in place only by its own weight. He placed both hands against it, feeling the cold surface once more, the faint vibration pressing into his palms, and he hesitated, not out of fear, but out of respect for the unknown that waited on the other side, because some doors were not just barriers, they were thresholds, and once crossed, nothing remained quite the same. The dog moved to his side, sitting quietly, his presence steady, grounding, as if reminding Ethan that he was not facing this alone. Ethan nodded slightly, more to himself than to the dog, and then, with a slow, controlled motion, he began to pull the door open, the metal groaning softly as it shifted, the seal breaking after years of silence, and from the darkness beneath, the air rose to meet them, cool, still, carrying with it the faintest hint of something long forgotten, and beneath it all, the pulse continued, steady as ever, counting out time that had never truly stopped. The darkness beneath the door did not rush to greet them. It waited, still and patient, as if it had been holding its breath for years, and when Ethan pulled the heavy metal panel open just wide enough to peer inside, the air that rose from below felt older than the forest itself, cool and unmoving, carrying a faint scent of iron and stone, not decay, not danger, but something preserved, something untouched. The dog stepped forward first, not hesitating, not afraid, his paws silent against the edge of the opening as he lowered his head and listened, truly listened, and Ethan followed, crouching at the threshold, his eyes adjusting slowly to the dimness, the light from above slipping down in thin, pale strands that barely reached the bottom of the narrow stairwell carved into the earth, each step worn but intact, leading down into a space that seemed to exist outside of time. Ethan reached back to the truck, retrieving a small flashlight, its beam cutting through the shadows in a clean, steady line, revealing the walls of the passage, reinforced with aged concrete, smooth in some places, cracked in others, but still strong, still deliberate, the kind of structure built to last long after its purpose had been forgotten. He hesitated for a moment, not out of fear but out of awareness, because once he stepped inside, there would be no pretending this was just another abandoned place. The dog looked back at him, his amber eyes calm, expectant, and Ethan understood. This was not something to observe from a distance. This was something to enter, slowly, carefully. He placed his foot on the first step, the sound soft but distinct in the quiet, and began to descend, the air growing cooler with each step, the light above fading until the only illumination came from the narrow beam in his hand. The dog moved ahead, but never out of sight, his body guiding the path without rushing it. And then the pulse came again, stronger now, not just something felt through the ground, but something that seemed to hum faintly in the air itself. Ethan paused, counting, 27, the rhythm unchanged, steady as a clock. That refused to stop. He reached the bottom of the stairs and stepped into a small chamber, the ceiling low, the walls lined with shelves that held objects covered in a thin layer of dust, tools, boxes, old equipment that had not been touched in years but had not been disturbed either, everything exactly where it had been left, as if whoever had built this place had expected to return, and yet never did. The dog moved to the center of the room, turning slowly in place before stopping near the far wall, his ears lifting, his head tilting slightly as he focused on something Ethan could not yet see. Ethan followed the direction of his gaze, sweeping the flashlight across the surface until it caught on a panel set into the wall, nearly invisible unless you knew what to look for, its edges precise, its outline too clean to be natural. Ethan stepped closer, his breath steady but his mind alert, recognizing the design. Hidden compartments, secondary spaces, places built to hold things that were not meant to be found easily. He ran his fingers along the seam, feeling for a latch, a mechanism, anything that would explain its purpose, and beneath his hand, he felt it again, the pulse, clearer now, no longer distant but close, almost as if it was coming from behind that very wall. The dog let out a soft sound, not urgent, not fearful, but certain, as if confirming what Ethan already sensed. This was the source. Whatever had been sending that steady rhythm had not come from the earth itself. It had come from here, from within. Ethan closed his eyes for a brief second, grounding himself, letting the silence settle around him. Because this was the moment where decisions mattered, where curiosity had to be balanced with respect for what might be waiting. He opened his eyes again and reached for the edge of the panel, applying gentle pressure, testing it rather than forcing it, and after a brief resistance, there was a faint click, almost too soft to hear, and the panel shifted. Slightly beneath his hand, the sound echoing in the chamber like a whisper breaking a long silence. The dog stepped back just enough to give him space, but his gaze never wavered, locked on the opening, as if he had been waiting for this exact moment. Ethan pulled. The panel opened slowly, revealing a narrow compartment beyond, and inside, resting on a small platform, was a device unlike anything that should have still been functioning after so many years, its surface worn but intact, a series of small lights pulsing in a steady pattern, one after another, each glow faint but unmistakable, and as Ethan watched, the rhythm aligned perfectly with the count in his mind, 27 seconds, then again, and again, as if the device had been marking time, waiting, calling out in a language only something trained, something attentive, could understand. The dog stepped forward once more, lowering his head slightly, not in submission, but in recognition, and Ethan felt a quiet realization settle over him. This was never about finding something lost. It was about answering something that had never stopped reaching out, something that had been waiting not just to be discovered, but to be understood. The faint glow of the device did not flicker like something dying. It pulsed with intention, steady and patient, as if it had been waiting for this exact moment. And Ethan stood there for a long time without moving, the beam of his flashlight resting over the small panel of lights that continued their quiet rhythm. 27 seconds, then again, each pulse soft but undeniable, the kind of signal that refused to be ignored. The dog remained beside him, his posture calm yet focused, his breathing slow, as though this place was not unfamiliar to him, as though something deep within his instincts had already mapped what Ethan was only beginning to understand. Ethan reached out slowly, his hand hovering just inches from the device, not touching it yet, respecting the fragile boundary between discovery and disturbance, because whatever this was, it had endured years without interference, and that alone meant it deserved caution. His eyes scanned the compartment more carefully now, noticing details that had not been obvious at first glance. A small label partially worn but still legible, a sequence of letters and numbers that carried the unmistakable structure of military designation. Beneath it, a narrow slot, sealed but intact, and to the side, a thin layer of dust disturbed only slightly, as if something had once been removed and never returned. Ethan's chest tightened with a quiet realization. This was not just a forgotten machine. It was part of something larger, something that had been left incomplete. The dog shifted slightly, his nose lowering toward the base of the compartment, inhaling slowly, not searching, but confirming, and then he lifted his head again, looking directly at Ethan, not asking, not urging, but waiting, as if this next step belonged to him alone. Ethan exhaled softly and finally let his fingers rest against the surface of the device, the metal cool beneath his touch, the vibration subtle but present, like the echo of a heartbeat that had never fully stopped. And in that instant, something changed, not in the room, not in the air, but within him, a memory surfacing, clear and sharp, of a night long ago when he had listened for signals beneath collapsed concrete, counting seconds, waiting for a sign that someone was still there, still holding on. He had learned then that timing mattered, that patterns were not accidents, they were messages, and now, standing in this quiet chamber, that same understanding returned to him, steady and certain. He withdrew his hand slowly and looked again at the narrow slot beside the device. Reaching into his pocket, he pulled out a small multi-tool, the metal glinting briefly in the dim light, and with careful precision, he worked at the edge of the seal, not forcing it, just easing it open, the material giving way with a soft resistance until finally it shifted, revealing a thin compartment within. And inside, protected from time and dust, lay a folded piece of paper, its edges yellowed but intact. Ethan paused, holding it gently between his fingers, aware that whatever was written there had been left with purpose, not discarded, not forgotten, but preserved, waiting for someone who would understand its weight. He unfolded it slowly, the paper making a faint sound that seemed louder than it should have been in the stillness of the chamber. And as his eyes moved across the lines, the words began to take shape, written in a steady hand, not hurried, not panicked, but deliberate. The message spoke not of fear, not of urgency, but of time, of waiting, of a signal that must continue until it was answered. A simple instruction repeated more than once. Do not stop the signal. It will lead them back. Ethan felt something shift in his chest, a quiet understanding settling into place. This was not a distress call in the way he had first imagined. It was a beacon, a guide, something meant to draw attention, to create a path where none existed. And suddenly the presence of the dog beside him felt different, no longer just a companion he had chosen, but part of a connection that extended beyond this moment, beyond this place, as if the dog had been shaped by the same purpose that had kept this device alive all these years. The dog stepped closer, his shoulder brushing lightly against Ethan's leg, grounding him in the present, reminding him that whatever this was, he was not facing it alone. Ethan folded the paper carefully and placed it back in the compartment, his movements slow and respectful. Then he looked once more at the pulsing lights, the steady rhythm that had carried on without fail, and he understood that stopping it was not an option, that whatever had been set in motion here was still unfolding, still reaching outward. And the question was no longer what this place had been, but what it was. Asking of him now, he turned his gaze to the dog, who met it without hesitation, and in that silent exchange, something passed between them, not words, not commands, but an agreement, unspoken and certain, that this was only the beginning of something far greater than either of them had expected. The steady pulse of the device no longer felt distant. It settled into the room like a quiet presence, something alive not in body but in purpose, and Ethan remained still for a moment, letting that rhythm anchor his thoughts. 27 seconds, always the same, always precise, as if time itself had agreed to keep this promise. The dog shifted slightly beside him, his gaze moving from the device to the narrow walls around them, scanning, listening, not for danger, but for something else, something unfinished. Ethan followed that instinct, lifting the flashlight and sweeping its beam slowly across the chamber, noticing details that had remained hidden in the first glance. Faint markings on the concrete, subtle scratches along the edges of the shelves, not random wear, but patterns left behind by hands that had worked here with intention. And then he saw it. Near the far corner, a small metal box mounted low against the wall, partially obscured by dust but intact, its surface marked with the same structured lettering he had seen before, official, deliberate. He stepped closer, the sound of his boots soft against the floor, the air still holding that faint metallic scent, and the dog followed, positioning himself just slightly behind Ethan's leg, not out of fear, but in quiet alignment, as if standing where he was meant to stand. Ethan crouched down, brushing away the dust with careful movements, revealing a latch that had not been opened in years. He hesitated briefly, not because he doubted what he would find, but because each new discovery seemed to deepen the story rather than explain it. And stories like this were not meant to be rushed. They unfolded in layers, each one revealing something not just about the past, but about the present, about why this place had called to him now. He opened the latch slowly, the metal giving way with a soft, restrained sound, and inside the box were several items arranged with care, not abandoned, not scattered, but placed, as if someone had intended for them to be found in exactly this order. A small journal, its cover worn but preserved, a set of tags bearing numbers and names, and beneath them, a photograph. Ethan lifted the photograph first, his finger steady, and brought it into the light. The image slightly faded but clear enough to see. Two figures standing beside a structure that looked very much like the one he was standing in now. One a man in uniform, the other a dog. A German shepherd, standing alert at his side. The resemblance was unmistakable, not identical, but close enough to stir something deeper than coincidence. Ethan glanced down at the dog beside him, whose ears twitched slightly as if he felt the shift in Ethan's attention, then back to the photograph, the connection forming quietly in his mind, not as a conclusion, but as a question that was beginning to answer itself. He set the photograph aside carefully and opened the journal. The pages filled with handwriting that matched the note he had found earlier. Steady, deliberate, each entry dated, each line carrying the weight of someone who understood time was not guaranteed. The entries spoke of maintenance, of signals, of a system designed to endure beyond its original purpose. But beneath the technical notes there was something else, something softer, references to a companion, a partner who never left his side, who listened when the world went quiet, who stayed when others could not. Ethan felt his chest tighten slightly as he read. The words not dramatic, not exaggerated, but honest in a way that did not need decoration. And then he found a line that made him pause. A simple sentence written with more space around it than the others, as if the writer had needed a moment before committing it to the page. If the signal continues, he will find his way back. Ethan read it again, slower this time, the meaning settling in differently. No longer just a statement, but a belief, a hope that had been strong enough to be written down and left behind. He closed the journal gently and sat back on his heels, the weight of what he was uncovering pressing into him, not heavily, but steadily, like the pulse that continued beside him. The dog moved closer, lowering himself to the ground beside Ethan, his presence calm, unwavering. And in that moment Ethan understood something he had not fully seen before. This was not just about a place or a device or even the man who had built it. It was about continuity, about something that had been set in motion and entrusted to time. And somehow, without searching for it, Ethan had stepped directly into its path. He looked down at the dog, whose eyes met his with that same quiet awareness from the auction yard. And it no longer felt like coincidence. It felt like alignment, like a thread that had been waiting to be picked up. The pulse continued, steady as ever. And Ethan realized that whatever came next would not be about uncovering the past alone. It would be about deciding what to do with it. Because some things are not left behind to be remembered. They are left behind to be continued. The chamber no longer felt abandoned. It felt occupied by something quieter than presence yet stronger than absence. And Ethan remained where he was for a long moment. The journal resting in his hands, the photograph lying beside him, and the steady pulse continuing without interruption. 27 seconds, always returning, always certain, as if reminding him that time had not been lost here. It had been held, preserved with intention. The dog shifted slightly, his body lowering into a relaxed but attentive posture, his head angled. Just enough to keep both Ethan and the device within his awareness, not guarding, not watching, but accompanying, as if he understood that what mattered now was not urgency but clarity. Ethan exhaled slowly, the weight in his chest no longer confusion, but something closer to recognition, and he looked again at the photograph, studying the man in uniform more carefully, the set of his shoulders, the quiet steadiness in his stance, the way his hand rested near the dog beside him, not gripping, not controlling, but simply present, the kind of connection built over time, not forced. And Ethan felt a subtle shift within himself, a memory not fully formed but close enough to touch, of trust built in silence, of companionship that did not need explanation. He set the photograph down gently and reached again for the journal, turning a few more pages, each entry carrying the same steady tone, not dramatic, not desperate, but purposeful. And as he read, a pattern began to emerge, references to maintaining the signal, to checking its integrity, to ensuring that it continued even when there was no immediate reason to believe it would be answered. And then, scattered between those entries, small notes about the dog, brief but meaningful, lines that spoke of listening together, of waiting without losing patience, of understanding that some things took longer than expected but were still worth holding on to. Ethan paused on one entry, his eyes moving slowly across the words, sometimes. The signal is not for those who left, but for those who are meant to arrive. He read it twice, the meaning settling deeper with each pass, and something in that sentence felt less like a reflection of the past and more like an explanation of the present. He closed the journal and rested it carefully back inside the box, his movements deliberate, respectful, as if acknowledging that he was now part of a story that had begun long before him. The dog stood then, not suddenly, not with urgency, but with a quiet decision, his ears lifting slightly as he turned his head toward the stairwell, listening again, and Ethan followed his gaze, noticing the subtle change in the air, not in temperature, not in sound, but in feeling, as if the space itself had shifted now that something had been understood. Ethan rose to his feet slowly, brushing the dust from his hands, and looked once more at the device, the steady lights continuing their silent work, unchanged by his presence, unchanged by his discovery, and that steadiness gave him a sense of direction he had not felt in a long time. Because not everything needed to be fixed, some things only needed to be carried forward. He stepped back from the compartment and allowed the panel to rest loosely in place, not sealing it, not hiding it again, but leaving it accessible, as if acknowledging that it was no longer meant to remain unseen. The dog moved toward the stairs, pausing at the base to look back at Ethan, his expression calm, expectant, and Ethan nodded slightly, understanding the unspoken invitation. They had come here to find something, and now that they had, the next step was not deeper into the past, but forward into whatever this discovery would ask of them. He turned and began to ascend the steps, each one bringing him closer to the surface, the fading light above growing stronger with every movement. And as he reached the top, the forest greeted him with a quiet stillness that felt different now, less empty, more aware, as if the world above had been waiting just as patiently as the space below. The dog stepped out beside him, lifting his head to the evening air, his posture relaxed but attentive, And for a moment they both stood there, between what had been hidden and what was now revealed. The sky above dimming into a soft twilight, the trees standing tall and silent around them. And Ethan realized that whatever had been set in motion in that chamber had not ended when he stepped away from it. It had simply changed direction, moving outward instead of inward, and he felt it then, not as a thought, not as a conclusion, but as a quiet certainty that this path, whatever it was, had not begun at the auction, and it would not end here. Because some signals are not meant to be found and forgotten, they are meant to be followed, one steady step at a time. The forest felt different as they stepped away from the hidden door, not because anything had changed in its shape or sound, but because Ethan now carried something within him that made every detail sharper, more intentional. The wind brushing through the trees seemed to move with purpose, the fading light stretching across the ground like a quiet signal of its own, and beside him the dog walked with the same steady rhythm as before, each step measured, each pause deliberate, as if the path ahead had already been decided long before they arrived. Ethan glanced back once toward the place where the door lay hidden beneath the earth, now nearly invisible again in the dim light. And yet he knew it was no longer something lost. It was something active, something continuing its silent work beneath the surface, the pulse still there, steady, unbroken, a reminder that not all movements could be seen. They walked back toward the truck in silence, the gravel crunching softly under Ethan's boots, the dog moving slightly ahead before slowing just enough to stay aligned with him, never pulling, never lagging, always in that quiet balance that spoke of understanding rather than control. And as they reached the edge of the road, Ethan paused, resting, his hand briefly against the side of the truck, his eyes drifting toward the horizon where the last traces of daylight were fading into a deep blue. He had come here without direction, without expectation, but now there was something else, something forming beneath the surface of his thoughts, not a plan, not yet, but a sense of continuation. He opened the door and climbed into the driver's seat, the familiar creak of the worn leather grounding him for a moment, the dog stepping in beside him, without hesitation, settling into place as if he had always belonged there. Ethan started the engine, the low rumble filling the quiet space, and for a brief moment he simply sat there, hands resting on the wheel, listening, not just to the engine, but to everything around him, the wind, the distant rustle of leaves, and beneath it all, the memory of that steady pulse, still counting, still waiting. He drove slowly back toward town, the road winding through the trees, the headlights cutting a narrow path through the gathering darkness, and the dog remained alert, his gaze shifting occasionally, not restless, but attentive, as if he was still listening for something beyond what the road revealed. They reached the outskirts of town just as the first lights flickered on in the distance, small houses glowing softly against the night, the quiet hum of life returning in subtle ways, and Ethan felt a strange contrast settle in his chest. The ordinary world continuing as it always had, unaware of what lay hidden just beyond its edges, unaware of the signal that had never stopped. He pulled into a small gas station near the main road, the kind of place that had been there for decades, unchanged in its simplicity, and shut off the engine, stepping out into the cool night air, the fluorescent lights above casting a pale glow over the empty lot. The dog followed, his paws silent against the concrete as he stood close beside Ethan, his presence steady, grounding. Ethan walked toward the front of the building, pushing open the door with a soft chime, the inside warm and still, the faint smell of coffee lingering in the air. Behind the counter an older man looked up, offering a brief nod, the kind that did not ask questions but acknowledged presence. Ethan returned the nod and moved toward the shelves, not really searching for anything specific, just allowing himself a moment to stand in a place that felt ordinary, a contrast to what he had just experienced. And yet even here, he could not fully disconnect from it, because the sense of purpose he had felt in that chamber had followed him out. Settling quietly into the spaces between his thoughts, he paid for a bottle of water and stepped back outside, the night air cooler now, carrying a faint stillness that seemed to echo the forest behind him. The dog lifted his head slightly, his ears shifting as if catching something distant, and Ethan watched him carefully, recognizing that subtle change, that moment when the dog was not reacting to the present, but to something just beyond it. "You still hear it," don't you?" Ethan said softly, his voice barely above the quiet hum of the night. The dog did not respond with movement, but his posture held steady, focused, and Ethan understood, whatever that signal was. It had not stayed behind in the ground. It had extended outward. It had a reach, and that reach had not ended when they left the clearing. Ethan leaned lightly against the side of the truck, looking up at the dark sky above, scattered with faint stars that flickered like distant points of light. And for a moment, he felt something he had not felt in a long time. Not confusion, not emptiness, but direction, not clear, not defined, but present, like a path just beginning to reveal itself one step at a time. He glanced down at the dog once more, meeting those steady amber eyes, and there was no doubt now. This was not an ending. It was the quiet beginning of something that had been waiting far longer than he had realized, something that had chosen its moment carefully. And now, whether he had intended it or not, he was part of it. The road stretched ahead in a long ribbon of quiet asphalt, the headlights carving a narrow path through the dark as Ethan drove without rushing, his hands steady on the wheel, his thoughts no longer scattered but slowly aligning. The kind of alignment that does not come from answers, but from the right questions finally being asked. Beside him the dog remained still, his presence calm yet alert, his ears shifting now and then as if catching something just beyond the reach of sound, and Ethan began to notice it more clearly now, not as a vibration beneath his feet like before, but as a subtle awareness that lingered in the air itself, like a rhythm carried on something unseen, faint but persistent, the same 27-second pattern echoing quietly in his mind. They passed through the last stretch of town where the lights thinned out, and the road opened into a wider highway, the sky above deepening into a darker shade of night, the stars more visible now, scattered like distant signals across an endless expanse, and Ethan found himself glancing upward more than once, not searching for anything specific, but sensing that the pattern he had found beneath the ground might not have been limited to that one place. He slowed the truck slightly as they approached a long, empty stretch bordered by open fields, the kind of land that held sound differently, where even the faintest noise could travel farther than expected. And that was when the dog shifted again, more noticeably. This time, his body leaning forward, his gaze fixed ahead rather than to the sides, his ears lifted in perfect symmetry, and Ethan felt it too. That subtle shift, not a sound, not something he could point to, but something that felt like a direction, as if the rhythm that had once been contained beneath the earth was now guiding them outward. He eased his foot off the gas and let the truck roll to a gradual stop along the shoulder, the engine idling softly as the night settled around them. The dog did not wait this time. He stepped out as soon as the door opened, his movements purposeful but not rushed, leading a few steps ahead before pausing and looking back, making sure Ethan followed, and Ethan did. Stepping out into the cool night air, the scent of dry grass and distant earth filling his lungs, he closed the door quietly behind him and stood for a moment, letting his senses adjust, the highway silent, the fields stretching out on both sides, and then, faintly, almost imperceptibly, he felt it again, not through the ground, but through the air, a subtle rhythm that seemed to align with the one he had already memorized. 27 seconds, and then again, he turned slowly, scanning the horizon, his eyes settling on a distant rise in the land, barely visible in the dark, a silhouette against the faint glow of the sky, and the dog was already moving in that direction, not running, not pulling, just walking with that same steady confidence. Ethan followed, his boots pressing into the dry grass as they left the road behind, each step taking them further from the familiar and deeper into something that felt increasingly deliberate. The ground rose gently beneath their feet, the slope gradual but noticeable, and as they climbed, the air seemed to grow quieter, as if the world itself was narrowing its focus to this one place. The dog stopped near the top of the rise, his body still, his head lifted slightly, and Ethan stepped beside him, his gaze following the line of the horizon, and that was when he saw it, not a structure, not something solid like before, but a faint light in the distance, barely visible, blinking once, then again. The pattern subtle but unmistakable, 27 seconds apart. Ethan felt a quiet realization settle into place. This was not a single signal. It was a chain, a series of points connected by the same rhythm, each one waiting, each one calling. He exhaled slowly, his breath visible in the cool air, and for the first time since leaving the chamber, he felt something close to clarity, not about what this was, but about what it meant. This was not an isolated discovery. It was part of something larger, something that had been set into motion long ago and had never stopped moving. The dog glanced at him briefly, his expression steady, as if confirming what Ethan already understood, and in that moment there was no hesitation, no doubt, just a quiet acceptance of the path that had revealed itself. Ethan looked back once toward the road, the faint glow of the truck's headlights, barely visible now, a reminder of where he had come from. And then he turned his attention forward again, toward the distant light that continued its steady pulse, and he knew that whatever waited there was not just another discovery. It was the next step in something that had already begun, something that had chosen him not because he was searching, but because he had finally learned how to listen. The faint blinking light in the distance did not flicker randomly. It held its rhythm with the same quiet certainty Ethan had already come to recognize, steady and patient, as if it had nothing to prove and nowhere else to be. And he stood there for a moment at the crest of the rise, letting his eyes adjust, watching the pattern unfold again, one pulse, then darkness, then another, exactly 27 seconds apart. And beside him the dog remained still, his body aligned with the direction of that light, not tense, not uncertain, but grounded in a way that suggested this was not new to him. This was something he had been waiting to follow. Ethan took a slow breath and stepped forward, the dry grass brushing softly against his boots as they began to move down the other side of the slope, the ground uneven but manageable, the night air cool against his face. And with each step the light grew slightly clearer, not brighter, but more defined, its position fixed as if anchored to something beyond the visible horizon. The dog moved ahead just enough to lead, never too far, always within reach, his ears adjusting subtly, as if he was measuring the distance not in feet, but in time, in rhythm, in something deeper than direction. Ethan found himself matching that pace, not consciously, but instinctively, his body aligning with the movement, the quiet confidence of it. And as they walked, the world around them seemed to fall away, the distant road no longer visible, the faint sounds of town disappearing into silence, leaving only the soft rustle of grass and the steady echo of that unseen pulse. They walked for several minutes, the distance stretching longer than it first appeared, until the shape of something began to emerge in the darkness ahead, not a structure in the traditional sense, but a form, low and partially hidden, its outline blending into the land itself. And as they drew closer, Ethan could see that the light was not floating. It was fixed, mounted on a small metal post that rose just a few feet above the ground, its surface weathered but intact, the source of the blinking unmistakable now, a compact device, similar in size and design to the one beneath the earth, but exposed to the open air, its casing marked with the same faint lettering, the same deliberate construction. Ethan slowed as they approached, his steps becoming more measured, more aware, because this was no longer just a continuation. It was confirmation. This system, whatever it was, extended beyond a single point. It was a network, a chain of signals placed with intention, each one aligned with the next, each one waiting to be followed. The dog stopped just a few feet from the post, his head slightly lowered, his ears forward, listening, and Ethan stepped beside him, his eyes fixed on the device, watching as the light pulsed again, steady, unwavering, and for a moment, he did nothing. He simply observed, letting the pattern speak for itself, because there was something important in that steadiness, something that did not demand attention but earned it through consistency. He reached out slowly, his hand hovering near the device, not touching it yet, and he noticed something else, a small panel near the base, partially covered by dirt and grass, similar to the hidden compartment he had found before. Ethan crouched down, brushing the surface gently, revealing the edges of the panel, the latch still intact, though worn by time and exposure. He glanced at the dog briefly, who remained still, watching, as if acknowledging that this step belonged to Ethan alone, and with a careful motion, Ethan opened the panel, the hinge giving way with a soft resistance, and inside he found another compartment, smaller this time, but equally deliberate. and within it, a single object, a metal tag, its surface engraved with a sequence of numbers and a name. The letters worn but still readable. Ethan lifted it slowly, bringing it into the faint light of the blinking device, his eyes tracing the name with quiet focus. And something in his chest shifted again, not surprise, not confusion, but recognition, because the name was not unfamiliar. It matched one he had seen in the journal, one that had been written with care, with meaning, as if it carried weight beyond identification. He turned the tag over in his hand, noticing a small inscription on the back, a simple phrase etched deeply enough to endure time. Keep the signal alive. Ethan exhaled softly, the words settling into him with a clarity that felt both unexpected and inevitable. This was not just a system. It was a responsibility, something that had been passed forward, not through instruction alone, but through discovery, through connection. And as he stood there, the blinking light continuing its steady rhythm, he realized that the signal was not only meant to guide someone back, it was meant to find someone who would continue it, someone who would understand its purpose without needing it to be explained. He looked down at the dog, who met his gaze with that same calm awareness, and in that silent exchange, the meaning became clear. This path was not about reaching an end. It was about becoming part of something that did not end, something that moved quietly through time, waiting for those who were willing to listen, willing to follow, and willing to carry it forward. The metal tag rested in Ethan's palm longer than it needed to, its weight far lighter than what it carried, and he turned it slowly between his fingers, the engraved name catching the faint pulse of the blinking light, as if even that small object was part of the rhythm, part of the message that had been set into motion long ago. The dog remained still beside him, his gaze shifting once from the tag to the distant darkness beyond, as if aware that this moment was not just about what had been found, but about what it revealed. Ethan looked up again at the blinking device, the steady pattern continuing without hesitation, and something in his chest settled into place, not as a conclusion, but as a recognition that had been forming since the moment he first saw the dog in the auction yard. This had never been random. It had been aligned. Every step, every signal, every quiet pull in a direction he had not questioned. He closed his fingers gently around the tag and slipped it into his jacket pocket, not as something to keep, but as something to carry. And then he stood there for a moment, letting the silence speak, the kind of silence that was not empty, but full of meaning, waiting to be understood. The dog shifted then, stepping slightly ahead, his body angled toward the horizon once more, and Ethan followed his line of sight, noticing that the blinking light in front of them was not the only one. Farther out, barely visible at first, there was another, faint and distant, holding the same rhythm, the same quiet certainty, and then another, even farther still, forming a path that stretched beyond what the eye could easily follow, a chain of signals, each one placed with intention, each one waiting for the next. Ethan felt a quiet realization deepen within him. This was not a single story. It was a network of them, each point connected by the same purpose, the same belief that something or someone would one day follow the pattern and understand what it meant. The dog took a few steps forward, then paused again, looking back at Ethan, his expression steady, not urging, not questioning, but simply present, as if reminding him that the path was open, but the choice to follow it still belonged to him. Ethan glanced back once toward the road behind them, now barely visible in the darkness, a faint reminder of the life he had been living before this moment, the quiet drifting, the absence of direction. And then he looked forward again, toward the distant lights that continued their steady pulse. And the contrast was clear, not dramatic, not overwhelming, but undeniable. One path led back to what had been. The other moved toward something still, unfolding, something that did not promise answers but offered meaning. And that was enough. He stepped forward, his boots pressing into the earth with a quiet certainty that had not been there before, the dog moving beside him in perfect alignment, their pace unhurried but unwavering. And as they walked, the distance between them and the next signal began to close, slowly at first, then more clearly, the light growing more defined with each step, the rhythm remaining constant, guiding them without words, without force. And Ethan understood now that this was how it had always been meant to work, not as a map, not as a set of instructions, but as a series of moments, each one leading naturally into the next, each one revealing just enough to keep moving forward. And as they reached the next point, another small device rising from the ground, another quiet pulse marking time. Ethan did not hesitate. He approached it with the same calm awareness, the same respect for what it represented. And when he opened the small compartment at its base, he found another piece of the story waiting, another name, another message, another confirmation that this path had been built not by chance, but by intention, and that he was not the first to follow it, nor would he be the last. The dog stood beside him, his presence steady as ever, and Ethan felt something shift within him, not a question this time, but an understanding that the signal was not just calling someone back, it was creating a way forward, a way for those who had lost direction to find it again, one step, one signal, one quiet moment at a time. And as the next light blinked in the distance, steady and patient, Ethan did not need to think about what came next. He simply followed. The rhythm no longer felt like something outside of Ethan. It moved with him now, settling into the quiet space between his thoughts and his steps. And as he followed the line of blinking lights stretching across the open land, he began to understand that this path had never been meant to be rushed. It was built for those who would take the time to listen, to notice, to trust what could not be explained all at once. The dog walked beside him, steady and certain, his presence no longer just a guide but a companion in something deeper, something shared, and the night around them seemed to open rather than close. The darkness no longer hiding but revealing in its own quiet way. The next signal rose ahead, another small post anchored into the earth, its light pulsing in that familiar rhythm. And Ethan approached it with a calm that had replaced the uncertainty he once carried. He crouched down, opening the compartment with the same careful motion as before, and inside he found not just another tag or a brief message, but something different, a folded envelope, sealed but preserved, its edges worn yet intact. As if it had been waiting longer than the others, he paused before opening it, his fingers resting lightly against the paper, aware that whatever was inside had been left with intention, not just to be found, but to be understood. The dog sat beside him, his gaze steady, his ears relaxed but attentive, as if he too recognized the weight of this moment. Ethan opened the envelope slowly, the paper inside unfolding with a soft sound that seemed to carry further than it should, and as his eyes moved across the words, the message revealed itself not as instructions, not as technical notes, but as something personal, something written not for anyone in particular, but for whoever would one day stand exactly where he was standing now. The words spoke of time, of patience, of building something that could endure beyond a single lifetime, of trusting that even if the path was not followed immediately, it would one day be seen by someone who needed it. And then there was a line that held his attention longer than the rest. The signal is not just a guide. It is a reminder that no one walks alone. Even when the road is quiet, Ethan read it again, slower this time, letting the meaning settle deeper, and something within him shifted, not dramatically, not suddenly, but in a quiet, steady way, like the first light of dawn breaking through a long night. He folded the paper carefully and placed it back into the envelope, then into his jacket, not as something to keep hidden, but as something to carry forward, something that now belonged to the path he was walking. He stood and looked out toward the horizon, where the next light blinked patiently in the distance, and he realized that this was not about reaching the end of the chain. It was about understanding why it existed at all. Each signal, each message, each small piece left behind was not just a marker, it was a continuation of something that had been started with intention and trust, and that trust had extended far enough to reach him. Standing here now, the dog rose beside him, his body aligning once more with the direction ahead, and Ethan felt no hesitation, no need to question what came next, because the path had already shown him enough to keep moving. They walked forward together, the distance between one signal and the next no longer feeling uncertain but purposeful, and as they moved, Ethan began to notice something else, something that had been there all along but had not yet been clear, the spacing between the signals, the rhythm of their placement. It was not random, it followed a pattern, a structure that extended beyond the physical markers, something that connected them not just across distance, but across time. as if each one had been placed with the knowledge that it would be found not in sequence, but in readiness, when the right person reached the right moment. And that realization did not overwhelm him, it steadied him, because it meant that he did not need to understand everything at once. He only needed to take the next step, to follow the next signal, to continue what had already begun. The night air remained cool and still, the stars above holding their distant glow, and the dog walked beside him with the same quiet loyalty that had been present from the very beginning. And Ethan understood now, not as a thought, but as a certainty, that this journey was not about finding something that had been lost. It was about becoming part of something that had never stopped waiting. The final stretch of land opened quietly before them, not marked by anything dramatic or overwhelming, but by a stillness that felt complete, as if the path itself knew it had reached a place where movement was no longer the point. And Ethan slowed his steps without needing to think about it, the steady rhythm of the signals continuing behind him and ahead of him. But here, in this space, something shifted. The lights did not stop, but their meaning changed, no longer guiding, no longer calling, but simply existing, as if the journey had led not to an end, but to an understanding. The dog moved beside him with the same calm presence, his posture relaxed now, his ears no longer searching, as if whatever he had been listening for had already been found. Ethan stood for a moment at the center of that quiet field. The night stretched wide around him, the stars above steady and distant, and for the first time since this path had begun, he did not feel the need to move forward. He did not feel pulled by the next signal. He simply felt present, fully, completely. The envelope in his jacket rested close to his chest, the tag he had found earlier carrying its quiet weight, and all of it together formed something he could not easily name, not a destination, not a reward, but something deeper, something that had taken shape not through answers, but through experience. He looked down at the dog, who met his gaze with that same steady awareness, and in that moment there was no question left between them, no uncertainty, only a shared understanding that this had never been about where they were going. It had always been about what they were becoming along the way. Ethan turned slowly, looking back across the distance. They had traveled, the faint blinking lights marking the path behind them, each one still pulsing, still waiting, still ready for whoever might one day follow. And he realized then that nothing here needed to be finished, nothing needed to be closed, because this was not a story that ended. It was one that continued, quietly, patiently. Through time, he reached into his pocket and took out the metal tag, holding it for a moment in the soft light, the engraved name catching just enough glow to remain visible. And he understood now that carrying it did not mean holding on to the past. It meant honoring it by moving forward, by becoming part of the same quiet chain that had brought him here. He slipped it back into his jacket and took a slow breath, the air cool and steady, grounding him in the present. The dog stepped forward slightly, then paused, not to lead this time, but to walk with him, side by side. And Ethan took that step with him, not because he had to, not because something was pulling him forward, but because he chose to, because the path ahead no longer needed to be explained, it only needed to be walked. And as they moved away from that quiet center, the signals continued their steady rhythm behind them, not fading, not disappearing, but remaining, a quiet reminder that some things do not need to be understood all at once to be meaningful. They only need to be followed with patience, with trust, with a willingness to listen. And as the night stretched on and the world remained calm and still, Ethan felt something settle within him that had been missing for a long time. Not a sense of closure, but a sense of belonging, not to a place, not to a destination, but to a purpose that moved quietly through each step he took. And the dog remained beside him, not as something he had saved, but as something that had found him at the exact moment he was ready to listen. And in that quiet understanding, the journey did not end. It simply became part of who he was, a steady rhythm carried forward into whatever came next, because sometimes, the ones we believe we rescue are the ones who guide us back to something we did not know we had lost. And sometimes, the path we were never looking for becomes the one that leads us home.